The next type of staining that I'd like to demonstrate for you is negative staining. Negative staining is another type of simple staining. We're only using one stain, but in a negative stain, we're using an acidic dye instead of a basic dye. Again, think about the charge of the cell, think about the difference between acidic and basic dyes that we talked about in the lecture slides, and kind of predict what you think might happen when using a negative stain. So the procedure for doing negative staining is slightly different from our basic direct staining. So we will take a slide, and on this slide we are going to add a drop of our negative stain. The negative stain that we're using is called nigrosin. So I'm going to unstopper my nigrosin, and I don't want to add too much, so I'm just going to add a drop of nigrosin to one end of the slide. I think that drop is sufficient. I'm going to put my slide down so I can restopper my dye. And then I'm going to grab a loop full of my liquid culture. So I'm going to sterilize my loop. Okay, that should be cool enough. I'm going to grab Klebsiella again. And this time what I'm going to do is, with my loop full of bacteria, I'm going to mix my loop full of bacteria into my dot of dye. I'm not going to spread the dye, I'm just kind of stirring my loop full of bacteria into the dye. I think that's good. I'm going to rinse my loop. First I'm going to sterilize my loop, then I'm going to rinse it to get the dye off. But I don't want to put the bacteria in my chemical waste. So sterilize my loop and now rinse to make sure I get all the dye off. I think I'll sterilize it just one more time. Okay, so the next step in the negative stain is, I guess, what you could call the tricky step. So we take a second slide. Got my first slide that has my stain with the cells mixed into it. I've got my second slide that has nothing on it, and I'm going to kind of push it back along here until I come into contact with the stain. And when you do that, you'll see that the stain kind of spreads along the surface of the second slide, and now we just pull. And we end up having a thin layer of dye over the entire surface of the slide. So what we'll do now is wait for that to air dry. So that'll take some time. Once it air dries, we'll visualize it under the microscope, and I'll show you what it looks like. So just like before with the direct methylene blue stain of Klebsiella, the Klebsiella wasn't concentrated enough. So I went ahead and redid the negative stain using E. coli, because the E. coli was much more concentrated. And so what we're seeing in this image now is the negative stain. So the reason this is called a negative stain is because the stain actually is negatively charged and is repelled by the cell wall, or the cell membrane, which is also negatively charged. And so you get the exclusion of the dye from the cell, but the dye actually stains the background of the slide. You notice we didn't rinse with water, we didn't heat fix, because we're not doing any of those rinsing steps. We're just doing that one smear. And so negative staining is really useful to allow you to see extracellular structures. Sometimes you can see flagella, sometimes you can see capsules this way. This also is really helpful for seeing really small or thin bacteria, because you'll have more of a void where the microbes have excluded the stain.